Hey everyone and welcome. Today we're digging into one of the most heated topics out there, immigration. But we're going to skip the usual political talking points. Instead, we're going to unpack the economic story, a story that when you really look at the research is way more complicated and surprising than you might think.
So let's jump right in with this one powerful sentence from the author Max Frisch. Economist George Borjas says this quote gets right to the heart of the entire immigration debate. We called for workers, but people came. It just perfectly captures the tension, the gap between seeing immigrants as just units of labor and the reality that they're actual human beings who change the places they move to.
To really get what's going on here, we first have to start with the simple story. This really powerful, almost utopian economic idea that some people have called trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk.
The theory itself is actually pretty simple, kind of elegant, really. Just imagine it's like a perfect economic machine. You have a worker in a low-income country, and maybe they produce, say, $5 of value an hour. But you take that same worker and put him in a high-income country with better technology, better infrastructure, and suddenly they can produce $50 an hour. So open borders theory just says, let him move. The worker's better off, and the entire world gets a huge productivity boost.
And the potential payoff here? It is absolutely staggering. I mean, some economic models say that if we just let people move to where they'd be most productive, global GDP could jump by as much as $28 trillion. That's with a T. And that's even after you factor in the massive costs of actually moving all those people. It's a number so big, it's hard to even wrap your head around.
So, if the gains are that massive, you got to ask, right? Why don't we just do it? Well, this is exactly where that simple, clean economic story starts to get messy. Because those models, they often treat workers like they're all just identical cogs in a machine. But remember that quote? People came, not robots.
Right, and people bring more than just their suitcases. They bring their entire social and cultural fabric with them. And this introduces this really critical idea called productivity spillovers. Basically, the idea is that the very things that make rich countries rich, stuff like trust, social norms, good government, well, that secret sauce could get diluted if you have a massive wave of people coming from places with very different norms.
Okay, so check this out. This is a brilliant example of how these invisible norms have very real consequences. There's this famous study that looked at unpaid parking tickets from UN diplomats in New York City. At the time, they had diplomatic immunity, so there was no real penalty for not paying. So what happened? Well, diplomats from countries with really low corruption like Japan and Norway, they had zero violations, not a single one. But diplomats from countries with higher corruption rates, they racked up tons of tickets. It was the same rules, same city, but totally different behavior, all driven by the cultural norms they brought with them.
So what happens when you plug this idea of spillovers back into that big economic model? The result is kind of mind-blowing. If you assume that a huge wave of migration makes the host country lose just half of its productive advantage, those $28 trillion in gains don't just get smaller, they completely disappear and actually turn into a net loss for the world. Suddenly, those trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk start to look a lot like monopoly money.
Okay, so let's zoom in a bit. Let's leave that global view and see how this actually plays out inside a single country, like the United States. Borjas argues that even if the country as a whole gets a net benefit from immigration, those gains are not shared equally. Not at all. There are clear winners and clear losers.
The total net gain to the native-born population, what economists call the immigration surplus, is actually pretty small when you think about it. We're talking about $50 billion a year. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but in a multi-trillion-dollar economy like the US, it's basically a rounding error.
But, and this is the really crucial part, that tiny $50 billion net gain on the surface, it's hiding a massive shift of money underneath. The model suggests that about $500 billion gets moved from the pockets of low-skill American workers whose wages get pushed down by more competition into the pockets of business owners and companies who get to benefit from cheaper labor.
And look, this dynamic isn't some new thing. This quote is from Frederick Douglass, way back in 1855. It just goes to show you that for more than 150 years, people have noticed that the pressures from immigration are felt the most by the most vulnerable workers who are already here.
So, you might be wondering, if these trade-offs are so significant, why isn't this the main story we always hear? Well, this brings us to a fascinating part of this whole thing, how the research itself, the data, and who's looking at it, becomes a huge part of the narrative.
All right, let's go back in time to 1980. Something totally unexpected happens. Fidel Castro suddenly announces that anyone who wants to leave Cuba can just leave. From the port of Mariel, Within just a few weeks, over 100,000 Cubans, many of them low-skilled workers, landed in Miami. And just like that, economists had a perfect, real-world natural experiment on their hands.
So the big question is, what happened? You suddenly increased the supply of low-skilled labor in one city by 8% almost overnight. What does that do to the wages of the low-skilled workers who are already living and working there?
Well, this is where it gets super interesting. The first and most famous study on this, by an economist named David Card, became legendary. It basically found nothing. No significant effect on wages or unemployment. But then, decades later, Borjas goes back to the very same data, and he argues, hey, wait a minute, you have to look at the specific group that was most affected, native workers who didn't finish high school. And when he did that, he found their wages dropped a lot. And that reanalysis, well, it kicked off one of the biggest debates in modern economics.
And this whole debate kind of points to a larger critique, voiced here by Oxford professor Paul Collier. He's basically saying that there's this immense pressure in the social sciences to produce research that confirms a positive, it's good for everyone story about immigration, even if it means stretching the data to get that result.
Okay, so all of this leads us to the final and maybe the most important takeaway from everything we've looked at. If immigration isn't a simple win-win, if it really does create both winners and losers, then immigration policy isn't a science problem with one right answer. It's a choice about our values.
At the end of the day, the evidence seems to point to a really clear trade-off. The immigrants themselves, they gain enormously. Businesses that use their labor, they gain. Even high-skilled natives might see small gains. But the low-skilled native workers who are competing for those very same jobs, they face real losses. So any policy we choose is a decision about how to weigh all those competing interests.
And that leaves us with the final, really provocative question that Borjas poses. And it's not a question that a spreadsheet or an economic model can answer for you. It's a question of values. In this incredibly complicated equation of winners and losers, who are you rooting for? Whose well-being do you decide to prioritize? Because that choice, that's ultimately what defines an immigration policy.